For most of human history, archaeology had one simple constraint. It could only study what lay in or on land. Nearly everything we think we know about the ancient world, its cities, its empires, its trade routes, and collapses, comes from what survived above the surface of the ocean, from ruins that resisted erosion, from stone laid carefully enough to remain visible long after the people who built it were gone. Beyond that boundary was the sea. For a long time, it was treated less as a place and more as an absence, where ships disappeared, ports eroded, and coastlines slowly slipped out of reach. Anything that fell beneath the surface was assumed to be gone for good, not just physically unreachable, but beyond history itself. That assumption shaped how the past was written. Traditionally, archaeology has focused on permanence, on who built the largest cities, who left inscriptions behind, who carved their victories into walls meant to endure. And in doing so, it quietly overlooked another kind of life that existed alongside those civilizations. People whose whole world was the shoreline. People who moved with the seasons. People whose lives unfolded between ports rather than within them. Those people mattered. But for centuries, there was no reliable way to find them. That began to change less than 50 years ago. This is the story of the Bronze Age sea peoples. In the earliest years of underwater exploration, what happened below the surface could hardly qualify as archaeology. Divers would reach shipwrecks with limited time, limited visibility, and a simple priority: recover what could be brought back up. An amphora might be lifted free of the sand, a bronze tool pulled loose from a cluster of debris. Each object surfaced alone, separated from the place it had rested and the other items that once surrounded it. Once removed, much of that object's meaning disappeared with it. On land, archaeology depends on relationships, how objects sit beside one another, how layers form over time, how a site comes apart slowly and predictably. Underwater, none of that order held. Sediment shifted with currents. Visibility changed by the minute. The act of touching the site could alter it permanently. For a long time, that made interpretation nearly impossible. Artifacts survived, but the sequence of events that placed them there did not. That began to change only when divers stopped treating wrecks as places to retrieve from and started treating them as places to read. As scuba technology improved and bottom times lengthened, archaeologists themselves began descending to the sites. Cameras followed, measurements were taken, positions were recorded before anything was moved. Shipwrecks were approached slowly, sometimes left untouched for entire seasons, while teams documented what lay where and why it might matter. For the first time, the seafloor could be studied rather than disturbed. Patterns began to emerge: cargo distributions, living spaces, signs of damage during sinking. Details that only made sense when viewed together. A wreck stopped being a collection of objects and began to resemble an event preserved in place. And as those methods took hold, the discoveries that followed were no longer isolated finds. They became narratives, and those narratives began to challenge what archaeologists thought they understood about the ancient world. One of the earliest underwater sites to unsettle archaeologists lies off the southern coast of Turkey, near Cape Gelidonya. This ship went down around 1200 BCE, a moment when the eastern Mediterranean was under extraordinary strain. On land, the archaeological record from this period is fractured and violent. Burn layers appear in city after city. Palaces are abandoned. Writing systems fall out of use. Trade networks that had connected entire regions unravel within a few generations. Today, this moment is known as the Bronze Age collapse. When divers first reached the Gelidonya wreck, they expected to find the familiar markers of late Bronze Age trade: finished goods, ceramics, objects meant to move between powerful states. Instead, what lay across the seabed told a different story. The cargo was almost entirely metal. Broken bronze tools, weapon fragments, ingots, and scrap, collected intentionally and packed for transport. Nothing ceremonial, just material, heavy, valuable, and meant to be reused, reshaped. This wasn't a ship delivering prestige goods. It was moving the raw ingredients of technology itself. At a time when cities were falling and political systems were breaking apart, someone was still navigating the Mediterranean, gathering bronze and carrying it from place to place. The ship feels practical in every sense, built for work, not display. Its cargo suggests adaptation rather than prosperity, an effort to keep tools and weapons functioning as the structures that once supported them began to disappear. Almost immediately, the sight raised a quiet but unsettling question. Who was still sailing when so much of the known world had stopped? Further offshore, at greater depth, another wreck would complicate the picture even more. The Ulu Burun shipwreck lies between 40 and 60 meters below the surface off the Turkish coast, and its excavation stretched across more than a decade. The ship went down around 1300 BCE, roughly a century before the Gelidonya wreck, at a time when the Bronze Age world still appeared stable. What archaeologists uncovered there was extraordinary. The cargo reflected a level of connection that few had imagined possible for the ancient Mediterranean. Copper ingots traced back to Cyprus lay beside tin that likely originated far beyond the region. Canaanite jars still held resin. Mycenaean weapons rested near Egyptian jewelry. Glass ingots colored deep cobalt blue were packed alongside amber that could only have come from the Baltic. Taken together, the materials didn't point to a single port or a single destination. They pointed outward, across continents. Ulu Burun revealed a world bound together by sea routes, where materials moved vast distances before ever reaching their final use. Entire economies depended on access to distant mines and stable maritime corridors. What surfaced from that wreck wasn't just a ship's cargo, but the outline of a system, intricate, interconnected, and quietly vulnerable. When archaeologists reconstructed the vessel's likely journey, it became clear that it hadn't been exceptional. It was one thread in a dense network that spanned the eastern Mediterranean, which is what made its loss feel so heavy in retrospect. Because within only a few generations of Ulu Burun's sinking, that network had collapsed. The routes fell silent, the flow of materials broke down, and the world the ship represented disappeared almost entirely from the archaeological record. In its wake, something unfamiliar began to emerge. The first clues appear far from the wreck sites themselves. They come from Egypt. Carved into the walls of temples built during the reign of Ramses III are scenes that stand apart from most royal records of the period. Ships with tall prows collide at sea. Warriors struggle across crowded decks. Bodies fall into the water amid the chaos of battle. The accompanying inscriptions describe groups arriving from across the sea, striking coastal regions throughout the eastern Mediterranean in rapid succession. The Egyptians recorded their names, the Sherden, the Peleset, the Denyen, the Tjeker, but offered little explanation beyond that. Today, these groups are known collectively as the Sea Peoples. What makes the record so unsettling isn't the conflict itself. Egypt had faced invaders before. What's striking is how little certainty appears in the descriptions. The inscriptions don't point to a homeland. They don't identify a ruler or a capital. They just describe movement, fleets arriving from offshore, sometimes accompanied by families, carts, and possessions. These were not raids in the conventional sense. They were more like migrations. And then, almost as abruptly as they appear, the Sea Peoples fade from view. No cities can be conclusively attributed to them. No inscriptions survive in their own voice. No ruins clearly mark a center of power. For generations, historians searched across the Mediterranean landscape for physical evidence of who they were and where they came from. But mostly, they found silence. This is where marine archaeology begins to change the question itself. If a culture was shaped primarily by the sea, if its communities lived along shifting coastlines, moved seasonally, and depended on ships rather than permanent architecture, then it would leave behind a very different kind of record from the civilizations archaeology has traditionally focused on. Its traces wouldn't take the form of monumental stone or enduring cities. They would be smaller, more temporary, and far easier to lose. They would be anchors dropped and abandoned, harbors built at the water's edge, camps used for a generation before the shoreline moved again. Over time, many of those places simply disappeared. As sea levels rose after the last ice age, vast stretches of ancient coastline were submerged across the Mediterranean basin. Landscapes where early maritime communities may have lived now lie tens of meters underwater, beyond the reach of earlier archaeological methods. For most of the discipline's history, those environments remained inaccessible, and whatever stories they held remained out of view. Even today, much of that terrain is only partially explored. As divers and archaeologists began surveying submerged harbors, documenting stone anchors, and recording unfamiliar wreck sites across the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean, subtle patterns started to surface. Not enough to clearly define a culture, but enough to raise new questions. Some ships don't fit established trade models. Some cargoes blended regions in unexpected ways. Weapons appeared alongside ordinary tools, suggesting vessels prepared for uncertainty rather than commerce alone. What emerged was not a single identity, but a sense of motion. People moving through a fractured world rather than operating within stable borders. In that light, the Sea Peoples begin to look less like a sudden invading force and more like a reflection of deeper instability. A population responding to pressures we're only beginning to recognize. This idea has only gathered momentum as exploration technology has pushed into deeper water. Much of the Mediterranean seafloor now lies beyond the limits of safe human diving, but remotely operated vehicles have changed what's reachable. ROVs can descend hundreds, sometimes thousands of meters, holding position in currents that would overwhelm a diver, their lights sweeping across terrain that hasn't been seen since antiquity. At the same time, the way sites are recorded has shifted just as dramatically. Photogrammetry allows archaeologists to capture thousands of overlapping images and stitch them into three-dimensional models accurate to the millimeter. A wreck can be measured, rotated, and studied long after the vehicle has surfaced, its spatial relationships preserved even if nothing is physically recovered. Wide area sonar surveys have added another layer. Multi-beam and side-scan systems can detect subtle irregularities in the seabed, low-relief objects, scattering patterns, depressions, features that once blended invisibly into the seafloor. Areas that would have taken decades to explore by diver can now be scanned in days. Together, these tools don't just reveal individual artifacts, they reveal structure. The Agadi Islands off western Sicily offer one of the clearest examples of what makes this possible. There, archaeologists identified an ancient naval battlefield dating to the First Punic War, spread across the seafloor nearly 2,000 years after the fighting ended. Bronze rams lay where ships once collided. Helmets and weapons appeared in dispersal patterns that aligned closely with ancient descriptions of the battle itself. The site wasn't interpreted from a single dramatic find, but from how hundreds of objects related to one another across space. For a long time, historians assumed this kind of evidence simply wouldn't survive underwater. Naval battles were thought to vanish with the ships that fought them. Agadi showed that assumption was wrong. And once that door opened, it raised a larger question. If conflict from the classical world can still be traced across the seafloor, then earlier encounters, older, less documented, far closer to the Bronze Age collapse, may have left their own signatures as well. The Sea Peoples are depicted fighting at sea. Their ships appear in Egyptian reliefs. Entire campaigns unfold offshore in the written record. Yet, no confirmed battlefield from that period has been identified. Not because the evidence contradicts it, but because, until recently, archaeology lacked the tools to look for something so diffuse, so wide-ranging, and so deeply buried. The search itself is still in its earliest stages. Marine archaeology has a way of unsettling certainty. Each discovery expands what we can see, but it also sharpens the outline of everything that remains beyond reach. Ulu Burun reveals a world once held together by remarkably complex connections. Gelidonya shows how people adapted as those systems began to fail. Egyptian inscriptions hint at the movement across the sea without ever fully explaining who was moving or why. Taken together, they suggest that the past may not fit as neatly into categories as we once believed. Civilizations do not always rise and fall in clean arcs. Sometimes they fracture gradually. Sometimes they disperse. Sometimes they continue on in quieter forms, leaving behind only partial traces. Fragments scattered along coastlines or resting beneath water that has shifted for millennia. For much of its history, archaeology favored what endured: stone walls, permanent cities, written records carved to last. But human life has never been limited to those places alone. Across every era, there were people who lived between worlds, along shorelines, aboard ships, within networks that left little behind once the sea reclaimed them. Their stories are harder to reconstruct, not because they are imagined, but because they were never built to survive in monument or inscription. Today, marine archaeologists are working across submerged landscapes that earlier generations could scarcely imagine accessing. Ancient shorelines are being traced. Prehistoric harbors are coming into view. Coastal settlements, once dismissed as speculation, are beginning to take shape beneath shallow water. With each new survey, the picture grows richer and less certain. History begins to feel less like a chain of empires and more like a tide, shaped by movement as much as by power. Advances in technology allow us to see farther than ever before, yet the farther we look, the more complex the past appears. The Sea Peoples remain unresolved, not because they left nothing behind, but because their traces rest in places we have only recently learned how to recognize. And even now, the ocean offers no guarantees. Every wreck adds detail, but rarely finality, a clearer image that resists settling into a single explanation. Archaeology is often imagined as the process of filling gaps, of turning uncertainty into knowledge. Marine archaeology suggests something quieter, and perhaps more honest. Some discoveries don't close the story, they widen it. As exploration continues, we are learning more about ancient humanity than ever before. How interconnected it was, how fragile its systems could be, how quickly stability could give way to movement and change. In that growing understanding comes a sense of humility. We may never fully understand the past, but the effort to reach it, to descend, to map, to question, continues to reshape how we see ourselves within it, not in search of final answers, but in pursuit of perspective. Stay curious, stay current, and thank you for watching.